The most dangerous window of your cardiovascular day is the first 3 hours after you wake up. The Onset Study. Tracking over 800 myocardial infarctions at Brigham and Women's Hospital found 40% more heart attacks between 6 and 10 in the morning than at any other time of day. Not because the morning is stressful, because the hormonal surge that launches your metabolism every morning is simultaneously the event most likely to rupture a vulnerable arterial plaque. The cortisol that mobilizes your glucose, the catecholamines that raise your heart rate, the platelet activation that prepares your blood to clot. The launch sequence that gets you out of bed is the identical sequence that kills more people before breakfast than at any other meal. There is a molecule your pineal gland is still clearing when your eyes open, and until it clears, your brain is running on hardware that is not fully booted. There is a signal your retina needs to receive in the first 2 hours that determines when you will be able to fall asleep tonight. And there is a blood viscosity peak. Your blood is thicker right now than it will be at any other point today. That explains why the dehydration of 8 hours without water has cardiovascular consequences. Most people never connect to the glass they do not drink. All of it comes later. Start with what happens before you open your eyes, because the launch sequence begins while you are still asleep. In the final 20 to 30 minutes of sleep, before the alarm, before consciousness, before any sensory input reaches the cortex, the adrenal glands begin accelerating cortisol production. This is not a response to waking. It anticipates waking, driven by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the master circadian clock, a cluster of roughly 20,000 neurons in the anterior hypothalamus that has been tracking time since before birth. Suprachiasmatic nucleus projects its circadian signal through the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus to the adrenal glands via the autonomic nervous system. The signal is temporal. Increase cortisol output now, because waking is projected to occur in approximately 30 minutes. The adrenal cortex responds by ramping up synthesis of cortisol from cholesterol through the steroidogenic pathway. Cholesterol to pregnenolone, to progesterone, to deoxycortisol to cortisol. Each enzymatic step accelerating in sequence. By the time your eyes open, cortisol is already climbing. In the 30 to 45 minutes after waking, it surges to its daily peak. The cortisol awakening response. The magnitude is extraordinary. Cortisol rises by 50 to 100% above the overnight baseline, reaching the highest concentration it will achieve in the entire 24-hour cycle. This single surge exceeds the cortisol response produced by moderate exercise, by public speaking, by an argument, by most acute stressors the day will deliver. Cortisol surge is not the only parameter shifting. Core body temperature, which reached its nadir at approximately 4 in the morning, dropping to roughly 36.2 degrees Celsius, begins rising before waking and continues climbing through the first hour. The temperature increase is driven by cortisol-mediated metabolic activation and sympathetic nervous system engagement. By 60 minutes after waking, core temperature has risen by half a degree to a full degree above its overnight low. The sensation of being cold when you first get out of bed and warmer 30 minutes later is not your perception adjusting to the room temperature. It is your core temperature rising through the steepest part of its daily curve. Surge is not stress. It is ignition. Cortisol at these concentrations mobilizes glucose from hepatic glycogen stores. The liver releases its overnight fuel reserves into the bloodstream, providing the brain and muscles with the energy substrate they need to transition from sleep metabolism to waking metabolism. Blood pressure rises, heart rate increases. Testosterone, which follows its own circadian peak in the morning, reaching its daily maximum within the first hour after waking, adds anabolic drive and motivational tone to the cortisol-driven metabolic activation. The prefrontal cortex begins receiving the increased cerebral blood flow it requires to come online. The immune system receives its daily deployment signal. The entire body shifts from the conservation mode of sleep to the operational mode of waking in a 45-minute hormonal crescendo. You have felt this without knowing what it was. The way the body seems to know it is time to wake up even before the alarm sounds. The shallow breathing that replaces deep sleep. The awareness of the room entering consciousness before the eyes open, the sense that the body is already running before the mind has decided to participate. That is the cortisol awakening response. The adrenal glands started the launch while you were still dreaming. Now, the cardiovascular consequence of the launch. Because identical hormones that get you out of bed are the ones most likely to cause a cardiac event. Morning cortisol surge is accompanied by a parallel surge in catecholamines. Adrenaline and noradrenaline released by the adrenal medulla and the sympathetic nervous system. Together, cortisol and catecholamines produce a specific cardiovascular state in the first 2 hours after waking. Blood pressure rises sharply from its overnight low. Heart rate increases by 15 to 25% above sleeping values. Coronary artery tone increases. The arteries that feed the heart muscle narrow slightly under catecholamine stimulation, and the blood itself changes composition. Platelet activation increases in the morning. Platelets, the cellular fragments responsible for blood clotting, become more adhesive, more aggregable, more ready to form clots. Simultaneously, fibrinolytic activity, the blood's capacity to dissolve clots, reaches its daily nadir in the early morning hours. Thicker blood, stickier platelets, reduced capacity to dissolve clots that form, narrowed coronary arteries, higher pressure driving the blood through those narrowed vessels. James Muller published the explanation in the Onset study in Circulation in 1989. Cardiovascular events cluster in the morning, not because mornings are stressful, but because the body's own launch sequence creates a transient state of maximum cardiovascular vulnerability. An arterial plaque that survived the gentle hemodynamics of sleep, low pressure, low shear stress, minimal platelet activation, is suddenly subjected to the highest mechanical forces of the day at precisely the moment when the blood is most prepared to clot and least prepared to dissolve a clot that forms. Plaque does not rupture because the person received bad news at breakfast. It ruptures because the cortisol and catecholamine surge increase the shear stress on the arterial wall to its daily peak, and the fibrous cap of the plaque, the thin layer of collagenous tissue that separates the lipid-rich necrotic core from the bloodstream, was not strong enough to withstand the mechanical load the morning imposed. The rupture exposes the lipid core to the bloodstream. Platelets, already at their most adhesive, immediately begin aggregating at the rupture site. The clot forms. If the clot occludes the coronary artery, the result is myocardial infarction. The timing was not coincidence. It was biomechanics. That is the finding underneath the statistic. Because it means the launch sequence is not safe. It is necessary and dangerous simultaneously. The same cortisol catecholamine surge that makes you sharp, alert, and physically capable at 8 in the morning is the event that ruptures vulnerable plaques at 8 in the morning. The launch sequence does not distinguish between useful activation and dangerous activation. It runs both through identical hormones at identical timing every day. The healthy artery tolerates the surge without consequence. The diseased artery may not. Well, and this is where the night before the morning begins to matter, because the cardiovascular system does not arrive at the morning surge from a neutral state. It arrives from whatever the night's sleep produced. During healthy sleep, blood pressure follows a pattern called nocturnal dipping, a 10 to 20% reduction below daytime values maintained by reduced sympathetic tone and increased parasympathetic activity through the night. DIP is not passive. It is an active maintenance program. While blood pressure is reduced, the arterial walls experience lower mechanical stress. Endothelial cells, the single-cell layer lining the interior of every blood vessel, use this low-pressure window to repair the microscopic damage that the day's hemodynamic forces imposed. Arterial smooth muscle relaxes. Vascular compliance, the ability of the artery to expand and contract elastically, is restored. Nightly dip is the body's cardiovascular maintenance window. It takes approximately 6 to 7 hours to complete its full restorative program, which is one of the reasons sleep researchers converge on 7 to 8 hours as the minimum for cardiovascular health. The number is not arbitrary. It is the duration the maintenance program requires. People who do not show normal nocturnal dipping, classified as non-dippers in clinical literature, have significantly higher rates of cardiovascular events kidney disease, and left ventricular hypertrophy. Non-dipping is more common with age, with obstructive sleep apnea, with chronic kidney disease, and with autonomic dysfunction. Obstructive sleep apnea deserves specific attention here because it is both common and underdiagnosed in people over 65. Each apnoeic episode, each time the airway collapses during sleep and breathing stops for 10 seconds or more, triggers a sympathetic surge that transiently spikes blood pressure and heart rate. In moderate to severe apnea, this can happen 30 to 50 times per hour. The nocturnal dip is obliterated, replaced by repeated sympathetic spikes that keep blood pressure elevated through the hours the maintenance program needs to run. The person sleeps for 8 hours, but the arterial walls receive no maintenance window. Morning after morning, the cortisol surge arrives at vessels that have not been repaired. The condition is diagnosable and treatable, and the nocturnal dipping pattern recovers when it is, which makes identification worth pursuing rather than worrying about. The non-dipper's arterial walls accumulate unrepaired damage. The endothelial repair is incomplete. The smooth muscle does not fully relax. Morning after morning, the cortisol surge hits arteries that are accumulating unrepaired damage from nights that did not provide adequate rest. The healthy artery that received a full 7-hour dip absorbs the morning surge without consequence. The vessel wall is flexible, well maintained, the endothelium intact. The artery that has been running on 4 or 5 hours of incomplete dipping for months or years absorbs identical surge into a less flexible, less well-repaired vessel. The hemodynamic load is identical. The capacity to tolerate it is not. This is why blood pressure measured at a doctor's office in the afternoon may read normal while the morning surge. The actual period of maximum cardiovascular stress goes unmeasured and unmanaged. The 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure monitor that some cardiologists prescribe captures what the office visit misses: the steepness of the morning rise, the adequacy of the nocturnal dip, the gap between the sleeping baseline and the waking peak. The morning surge is the cardiovascular event the standard blood pressure reading does not see. Steepness of the morning blood pressure rise, how fast the pressure climbs from its overnight low to its daytime operating level, is a cardiovascular risk marker independent of the absolute blood pressure values. A steep morning surge arriving at arteries that did not receive adequate nocturnal repair is a different hemodynamic event from a gradual rise arriving at well-maintained vessels. The night determines the morning. The morning's risk is written in the quality of the sleep that preceded it, and then the handoff that happens in the first minutes of waking. Because there is a second hormone leaving the stage as cortisol arrives, and the timing of the handoff governs your entire day. Melatonin, the hormone the pineal gland synthesizes from serotonin through a two-step enzymatic pathway, has been circulating at elevated concentrations through the night, maintaining sleep architecture and suppressing the arousal systems that would otherwise wake you prematurely. As dawn approaches, or as the alarm fires, melatonin production begins to decline. The decline is triggered by light reaching melanopsin-containing retinal ganglion cells in the retina, which signal the suprachiasmatic nucleus to suppress the pineal gland's output. Cortisol-melatonin handoff is the most precisely timed hormonal transition of the day. Melatonin falling, cortisol rising, the two curves crossing in opposite directions during the first 30 minutes after waking. If the handoff is clean, melatonin suppressed quickly by adequate light exposure, cortisol surging on its circadian schedule, the transition from sleep physiology to waking physiology is complete and well regulated. If the handoff is incomplete, melatonin lingering because the person woke in dim indoor light, cortisol arriving on schedule but into a system still partially running its sleep program, the result is the specific grogginess that people describe as not quite waking up, the sensation that the body is awake but the brain has not arrived. You know this feeling. The morning when the alarm went off in a dark room and you made it to the kitchen but could not form a complete thought for 20 minutes. The melatonin was still present. The cortisol was rising into a system that had not received the light signal to clear the sleep hormone. The two programs were overlapping. Waking physiology arriving before sleep, physiology had fully departed. The conflict between the two produces the specific cognitive fog that feels different from tiredness. Tiredness is insufficient sleep. Morning fog is incomplete hormonal handoff. Melatonin and cortisol occupying the same temporal space, their opposing signals competing for control of the arousal systems. The hormonal fog and the neural fog overlap, but they are different mechanisms, and they clear on different timescales. Here is the mechanism behind sleep inertia, and the neuroscience of why the first 30 minutes of your day feel different from the rest of it. Sleep inertia is not laziness. It is the measurable consequence of the prefrontal cortex operating below its full capacity while the transition from sleep state neural patterns to waking state neural patterns completes. Functional imaging shows reduced cerebral blood flow to the prefrontal cortex for up to 30 minutes after waking. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region that supports working memory, abstract reasoning, and decision-making, is the last cortical region to reach full operational capacity. During this window, reaction time is impaired. Working memory capacity is reduced. Emotional regulation is less calibrated. The amygdala is fully active, while the prefrontal regions that modulate its output are still coming online. The decisions made in the first 10 minutes of consciousness are made by a brain running with its executive function at reduced capacity and its emotional processing at full intensity. This has measurable consequences beyond mood. Driving performance in the first 30 minutes after waking is impaired to a degree comparable to moderate alcohol intoxication. Reaction times are longer, hazard perception is delayed, and the capacity for divided attention is reduced. The person who wakes up and immediately gets in a car is driving with a prefrontal cortex that has not yet reached the perfusion level it needs for the task. The risk is not theoretical. Traffic accident data shows elevated rates in the first hour after waking, and the mechanism is sleep inertia rather than drowsiness. The person does not feel sleepy, they feel awake, but slow, which is worse because it does not trigger the caution that sleepiness would. This is why the first email you read, the first news headline you see, the first interaction you have upon waking produces a disproportionate emotional response compared to the identical stimulus encountered 3 hours later. Dopamine and norepinephrine systems that support sustained attention and working memory take 20 to 30 minutes to reach their operational levels following the cortisol surge. Adenosine, the neuromodulator that accumulates during waking hours and produces the sensation of sleep pressure, has been largely cleared by overnight sleep, but residual adenosine in the prefrontal regions contributes to the inertia. The coffee consumed at minute 5 does not reach peak effect until minute 35, by which time cortisol has already done the work the person is crediting to the caffeine. The brain you wake up with is biochemically different from the brain you will have 45 minutes later. Sleep inertia is the gap between the body being awake and the brain being ready. You have experienced sleep inertia as the specific vulnerability of early morning. The thought that seemed catastrophic at 6 in the morning and merely inconvenient by 9. The email you composed in the first minutes of waking that you would have written differently an hour later. The argument that escalated at dawn and would not have escalated at noon. The amygdala was running at full power. The prefrontal cortex was not yet there to moderate it. The emotional architecture of the early morning is structurally different from the emotional architecture of the mid-morning, and the difference is cortical perfusion that has not yet reached operational levels. Now, the signal that determines when tonight's sleep will begin. Because the morning is not just the start of the day. It is the programming event for the night that follows. Circadian rhythm maintained by the suprachiasmatic nucleus is not exactly 24 hours. The endogenous free-running period in most humans is approximately 24 hours and 10 to 20 minutes, slightly longer than the solar day. Without external calibration, the clock drifts forward by those extra minutes each day, waking later, sleeping later, progressively shifting out of alignment with the light-dark cycle. The drift is constrained in people who maintain fixed schedules. The alarm clock forces waking at a consistent time, which forces the light exposure that resets the clock. Remove the alarm, as retirement does, and the drift accelerates. The retired person who no longer has a fixed wake time and who spends mornings indoors is particularly vulnerable to circadian drift because both constraints, the forced wake time and the forced light exposure, have been removed simultaneously. Calibrating signal is light. Specifically, light reaching the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, a subset of retinal neurons containing the photopigment melanopsin, which respond to wavelengths around 480 nanometers, the deep blue component of the visible spectrum. These cells do not contribute to vision. They send their signal directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus through the retinohypothalamic tract. Their function is not seeing. It is timekeeping. Reset must arrive within the first 2 hours of waking to be maximally effective. The intensity threshold is approximately 1,000 to 2,000 lux for robust entrainment. Indoor lighting, even bright indoor lighting, typically produces 100 to 500 lux. Outdoor light on a heavily overcast day produces 10,000 lux. Direct sunlight produces 50,000 to 100,000 lux. Arithmetic is stark. A person who spends their first 2 hours under indoor lighting is sending their suprachiasmatic nucleus a signal between 5 and 20 times too weak to produce robust circadian entrainment. The clock receives insufficient input. It drifts. The drift is small, 10 to 20 minutes per day, but it compounds. Correction is simple. 10 minutes of outdoor light exposure, not direct sunlight, not a special lamp, just being outside, where the ambient light exceeds the threshold, delivers more circadian signal than 2 hours under the brightest indoor lighting. The retinal ganglion cells do not need a cloudless sky. They need 10,000 lux, which the sky provides on any day that is not fully dark. A cup of coffee on the porch, a walk to the end of the driveway, the light entering the retina during those 10 minutes. Programs. The melatonin onset 16 hours later with more precision than any supplement or sleep hygiene protocol can achieve. After a week of exclusively indoor morning light, the circadian clock may have drifted forward by 1 to 2 hours. Melatonin onset that night is delayed by the same margin. Sleep onset is delayed. Sleep duration is compressed if the alarm time remains fixed. The cortisol awakening response the following morning arrives on the drifted schedule rather than the solar schedule. The entire circadian architecture is progressively misaligned by a signal deficit that occurred in the first 2 hours of the day. Think about the person who wakes at 7, makes coffee in a kitchen lit at 300 lux, eats breakfast, reads the news on a screen, and does not step outside until 9 or 10. By the time outdoor light reaches their retina, the 2-hour window for maximal circadian reset has closed. The signal arrives late and weak. The clock drifts. Tonight's melatonin is delayed. Tomorrow's cortisol curve is shifted. Over a working week, 5 consecutive mornings of indoor-only light in the first 2 hours, the drift compounds to the point where the circadian clock is operating as though the person lives in a different time zone from the one they actually inhabit. Friday night's insomnia and Monday morning's exhaustion are not random. They are the accumulated circadian debt of 5 mornings of insufficient light input, producing a melatonin onset that has drifted past the bedtime the person is attempting. The weekend does not fix it. Sleeping in on Saturday shifts the clock further, and 2 days of correction cannot compensate for 5 days of drift. Cascade began with 2 hours of indoor light that felt perfectly normal and produced a circadian signal too weak to maintain entrainment. And here is what most people do not connect. The morning and the night are a single biological event, separated by 16 hours. The melatonin that enables sleep onset tonight was programmed by the light that entered the retina this morning. The cortisol curve that will launch tomorrow morning was shaped by the melatonin timing tonight. The sleep architecture tonight determines the quality of the nocturnal blood pressure dip, which determines the cardiovascular vulnerability of tomorrow's morning surge. Every morning is the consequence of the previous morning's light exposure, transmitted through one full circadian cycle. One more system launching simultaneously, and this one reverses something most people believe about cortisol. Cortisol, at the concentrations the morning produces, the acute, time-limited surge, rather than the chronic elevation of prolonged stress, acts as a deployment signal rather than a suppression signal. The distinction is critical, and it reverses the common understanding that cortisol suppresses immune function. During sleep, Lymphocytes, including NK cells, T cells, and B cells, traffic from the peripheral blood into lymphoid tissues, lymph nodes, spleen, and mucosa, associated lymphoid tissue. They congregate there overnight, performing maintenance, exchanging information with antigen-presenting cells, undergoing the overnight immune consolidation that is one of sleep's primary functions. By the time morning arrives, the peripheral blood is relatively depleted of lymphocytes. They are in the depots, not on patrol. Morning cortisol surge reverses this. Cortisol at acute peak concentrations triggers the redistribution of lymphocytes from lymphoid tissue back into the peripheral bloodstream, a rapid mobilization that places immune cells back into circulation for daytime surveillance. NK cell counts in the peripheral blood rise measurably in the first hour after waking. The immune system that was consolidated and maintained overnight is deployed for the day's patrol. Vaccination timing follows from this directly. Studies have shown stronger antibody responses to vaccines administered in the morning compared to the afternoon, because the immune system is at its most actively mobilized state in the hours following the cortisol awakening response. The morning immune system is not just present, it is primed, opposite of what chronic cortisol elevation does. Chronic cortisol, the sustained elevation of weeks of stress, poor sleep, and sympathetic dominance, suppresses immune function by holding lymphocytes in tissues and preventing effective surveillance. Acute morning cortisol, the 45-minute surge of the cortisol awakening response, deploys them. One molecule, opposite effects, determined entirely by whether the exposure is a sharp peak or a sustained plateau. That distinction is what made the morning make sense to me, because it resolves the contradiction that most people carry without realizing it. Cortisol is supposed to suppress the immune system, yet the morning, when cortisol is highest, is when immune deployment is strongest. The resolution is duration. A sharp spike mobilizes. A sustained plateau suppresses. The morning cortisol peak is the sharpest spike of the day, and it drives the largest immune mobilization of the day. The stressed person's chronic cortisol is a plateau, and it drives sustained immune suppression. Same molecule, same receptors, opposite biological outcomes determined by the temporal shape of the signal. Well, and this connects directly to why poor sleep impairs immune function. A person who sleeps poorly produces a blunted cortisol awakening response. The morning surge is smaller, less sharp, less clearly demarcated from the overnight baseline. The blunted CAR produces a less effective immune deployment. Fewer lymphocytes are mobilized from the depots into the peripheral blood. Sheldon Cohen at Carnegie Mellon demonstrated the downstream consequence. Healthy volunteers exposed to identical rhinovirus doses were nearly 3 times more likely to develop a cold if they had been sleeping fewer than 7 hours. Not because poor sleep suppressed their immune cells, but because it blunted the morning signal that deployed them. 5 consecutive nights of poor sleep produces 5 consecutive mornings of blunted immune deployment. The person who catches every cold that circulates through the office is not necessarily immunocompromised. They may be underdeployed. The cells are present, but the morning signal that puts them into circulation is too weak to do its job. One more factor compounding the cardiovascular window, and this one is the simplest to address. You are dehydrated when you wake up. The body loses approximately 300 to 500 milliliters of water overnight through breathing and skin evaporation. Hematocrit, the percentage of blood volume occupied by red blood cells, rises overnight because the plasma has decreased while the cells have not. More viscous blood requires more pressure to push through narrowed coronary arteries, and the platelet activation is more consequential when viscous blood flows slowly enough for platelets to make sustained contact with the vessel wall. Between 6 and 9 in the morning, the cardiovascular system is running 5 risk factors simultaneously: highest blood pressure of the day, highest platelet adhesiveness, lowest fibrinolytic capacity, highest blood viscosity, and narrowest coronary arteries. The convergence is not pathological, it is the cost of the launch. The body accepts the cost because the alternative is not waking up. But adding dehydration-induced viscosity to a convergence that is already at its daily maximum is adding a sixth factor that a glass of water can reduce. Glass of water in the first minutes begins reversing the hematocrit shift within 15 to 20 minutes. The cardiovascular burden of the morning surge is reduced by the simple act of rehydrating before the cortisol peak arrives. First hour after waking is not an undifferentiated period of gradually becoming alert. It is a choreographed sequence with specific events occurring at specific intervals, and the order matters because each event depends on the one before it. In the final minutes of sleep, the adrenal glands are already preloading cortisol. At the moment of waking, the surge begins. Blood pressure rising from the nocturnal dip, blood at peak viscosity, melatonin still clearing. In the first 10 minutes, sleep inertia is at its deepest. Prefrontal cortex below capacity, amygdala fully active, core temperature at its lowest waking point. Between 10 and 30 minutes, the circadian reset arrives if light has reached the retina, plasma volume recovers if water has been consumed, and the prefrontal cortex approaches operational capacity. At 45 minutes, cortisol reaches its daily peak. Immune cells deployed, glucose mobilized, blood pressure at daytime level, cardiovascular vulnerability at its most acute. At 60 minutes, the launch is complete, and the cortisol curve begins its 16-hour decline toward the overnight nadir, shaped already by the light that entered the retina this morning. Every morning is this sequence. Every morning the outcome depends on what happened during the previous night's sleep and what happens in the first 60-minute window. The cortisol awakening response has been running since the person was born. It will run every morning until they die. Suprachiasmatic nucleus does not require instruction. Adrenal glands do not wait for permission. The sequence runs. Question is not whether it runs. It is what environment it runs in. Whether the night provided adequate dipping for arterial repair, whether the light that enters the retina in the first hour is sufficient to reset the clock, whether the first glass of water arrives before the viscosity peak compounds the platelet activation, whether the brain that makes the first decisions of the day is recognized as a brain still completing its boot sequence rather than a brain that has fully arrived. Tomorrow morning, when the alarm sounds or the eyes open on their own, the cortisol will already be climbing. The blood will be thicker than it will be at any other point in the day. The prefrontal cortex will be offline for the next 30 minutes. The suprachiasmatic nucleus will be waiting for the light signal that programs the night ahead. The immune depots will be preparing to release their cells into the bloodstream for the day's patrol. The arterial walls will be absorbing the first mechanical load since the overnight maintenance window closed. Every one of these events will proceed whether the person knows about them or not. The cortisol does not require understanding. The melanopsin does not require intention. The hematocrit does not respond to awareness. Body is already doing everything it knows how to do. It has been doing it every morning for a lifetime. Physics does not change because you learned it, but what you do in the first 60 minutes might.